Okay. So my talk will be about two recent and ongoing projects that are loosely related in the sense that both work with Swiss citizen science data on plants, using some different approaches to try and model distributions. Okay. So the first project uses recommender systems to analyze and predict plant communities from large compilations of partial inventories. What is important to note here is that we try to model distributions solely based on associations between species occurrence. So it's citizen science data, and then it's just co-occurrence, synthetic co-occurrence, as I will show, but no environmental information whatsoever, which is the standard way that we use to predict, we go to predict distributions of species usually. Okay, now I got it. So recommender systems, you might or might not have heard of them, but you certainly have encountered them because they are all over the internet. They are usually used to recommend items to users. You can have them in streaming platforms. They recommend the next song based on what you have heard before. They recommend products in online shops, news articles on news platforms, and even dating partners on dating platforms. And it's a fairly broad array of tools, ranging from simple filtering techniques to fairly advanced algorithms. And the idea basically is finding commonalities in the consumption behavior of users. So in this example, we have two people who both consumed the pizza and the salad, and given that one of them also consumed a beer, we might want to recommend that beer to the other one as well. So that's the general idea. In terms of data, that's what we typically work with. I mean, there are many extensions, but this is really the basis. It's called user behavior matrix, where we have products in the columns and users in the rows. And then we have interactions between users and products that can be either implicit, as in this case, where we know a user consumed an item, or they might be explicit in the sense that the user rated the item. The task of the recommender system then is essentially filling the unobserved interactions and ranking the likelihood that the user might like, another film as well, based on what he or she watched. Now, we can actually use that setup for biodiversity modeling too, by replacing, if I go back, we replace movies with species, and we replace users with sites. And then we might have partial community inventories where we know about the presence of some species, but not of all of them. And the task then is basically filling the inventories by predicting the most likely additional species to be observed at a certain location. Now, the method we use here is called hierarchical Poisson factorization. So I apologize already now, this is not deep learning. The other project will be about deep learning. But I think the idea here and the framing here can be very easily translated into the deep learning world as well. So yeah, this is mainly about the approach here. So the tool is a matrix factorization approach that basically tries to simplify a huge, sparse matrix of partial plant inventories into latent feature representations for the sites and for the species. So these are low-dimensional vectors that can be multiplied, and the cross product should give us something similar as the original matrix, which also fills these unobserved interactions and gives us a ranking. So we applied this approach to Swiss vegetation data. As training data, we used the entire database of the Infoflora data center that compiled, that's the official data center on plant data in Switzerland. So we had about 5 million observations by 2019. And those are mainly opportunistic observations of citizen scientists. There are some survey data from authorities going in there as well. But the approach we took here is very naive. We just threw a grid across the nation and pooled observations within each 93 by 93 meters cell, and considered cells with 20 or more species observed as sufficiently sampled. And those were then basically our partial communities. So it's synthetic communities. They, might not be just next to each other, but at least in the same hectare. As test data, we had official survey data, so full presence-absence data, reported at 10 square meter plot, so it's a bit a smaller scale, but it's a regular distribution. You can see the blue crosses here across Switzerland. And I should note, for testing, what we need to do in such a setup, we need to tell the model a few species such that it can then reconstruct the remainder of the community, because that's the sole information it uses, right? So we always had to randomly mute some and provide information on the others to the model to make predictions. So what this model does, if we go back to the architecture, is not only making predictions, but it also generates these latent features, and they are actually quite interesting to investigate as well. So that's what we did first here. So we have species-related latent features that give us a similarity of the species in their preference for sites. And we can further reduce this 9-dimensional representation that we have here with 9 features into a 2-dimensional space with TSNE in this case, a dimension reduction technique, and visualize the entire flora of Switzerland, which is all these gray dots that you see here. So those are all species, and the closer together they are, the more likely they are to be observed in the same sites. And we validated whether this is meaningful, what we get here, by using the Swiss typo-CH habitat classification system. That's a system very similar to the UNIS system in Europe that defines about 200 categories of different habitats, many of them vegetated. And for the vegetated habitats, you then get also a list of typical species. On the one hand, you get character species that are strictly bound to the habitat, and on the other side, you get companion species that are there, but also in some other habitats. They're not as strictly bound. And we can see that all those species cluster quite nicely in this space, with some exceptions. For example, let me see if I can find it, the square here. It's a species, Polygala calcarea, that mainly grows in a very restricted region in the Jura Mountains. So even though it is bound to the habitat, it's only co-occurring with the species in this region and not elsewhere, and that's why it doesn't really cluster with the remainder of the typical species. But in general, we can show that we get here a very nice approximation of co-occurrence at scale across the entire flora. Usually when you look at co-occurrence, you would need confirmed presence-absence surveys, and they are typically not done at the very large scale, so you would be limited to a certain type of habitat, for example. So that's a nice byproduct that we get here. And the other thing that we can look at are site-related latent feature scores. They describe the systematic differences between sites in terms of species community. Now, typically, in species distribution modeling, we would assume that these differences in community composition can be explained by environmental factors, such as climate, soil and topography, or vegetation structure. Then we can also assume that we have some spatial effects. I mean, for Switzerland, given that we have a relatively small study area, it's not as important, but still, some species are found in some regions, but not in others, as the one example I just mentioned before. So we also tried to explain these scores by spatial coordinates, basically, and also by sampling effort. The more people look, the more they might find the less conspicuous species, right? So we used a simple GAN to try and explain the variance that the feature scores of these site-related features with these factors, and we managed to explain about 2/3 of the variation on average, meaning that we have about 1/3 left that is unexplained by this typical gridded data we use in species distribution modeling, and I will give you a hint what these patterns could be explained with in the next slide. Now we look at performance. You see a couple of panels here. They show performance for different types of habitats. On the y-axis we have AUC, side-by-side AUC, so the capacity of the model to discriminate species present at the location from species absent at the location. And on the x-axis we have the number of known species that we provide the model to recreate the remainder of the community. And then our recommender system are basically the full lines. And you can see how performance increases. The more species we know, the better it is able to reconstruct the remainder of the community. And then we have some benchmark classical STMs against which we compare here. The disappointing part here is we don't really reach STM performance in most habitats. But we see that, for example, ruderal sites, which experience a lot of human disturbance or vegetation bordering along transport routes. In such cases, it seems to be particularly advantageous to look at associations as well, because they are not as well captured with gridded environmental data, because they are too small scale. In this case, I have to say, our grids were 100 by 100 meters, so they, of course, leave out some detail. So what could such a model be used for? One vision that we have would be a tool that supports citizen scientists when they do biodiversity monitoring in terms of making community surveys. If we had such a model that could instantly update the list of expected species at the site as the list of observed species grows, that could be an interesting solution, right? So the more it knows about what is already there, the more precise it can tell you what to look for next. So that was the first project. Now the second one is based on a deep STM that we developed over the past years, and we published a paper last year. Here I just want to briefly summarize what we did, and then I would like to make the next step and think about biodiversity dashboards as well. So how to make this information available to interested users. What we did here, again, we used the vegetation data of Infoflora, but this time it was 2022, so we had a few more, 6.7 million quality filtered observations for about 2,700 species. And we had quite fine environmental information, 25-meter resolution for climate, soil conditions, topography, vegetation structure, and land use, land cover. What we also did here, we had an explicit inclusion of season by also modeling a sine-cosine mapping of the observation date. The algorithm we used here is very simple compared to what we've seen earlier today. So it's a multi-layer perceptron with 4 residual blocks. And what we do is we model with multi-class loss. So the model question is, which are the most relevant species to be observed under a given set of environmental conditions and at a given date. So it's not necessarily that we explicitly model presence-absence of the community, but we want to have a relevance ranking, basically, of the species. What we used this for, on the one side, was to look at seasonal differences in observation probability, which can be done in such a setting quite well, because now for each pixel we can make predictions for each day in the season, and we can see how observation probabilities evolve, and we can summarize those, for example, with the day at which we have a peak in observation probability, which we can then bring back to a map. So here you see a map for the dandelion, and the colors indicate whether the species has a peak in observation probability early in the season or late in the season. And we could show that these probabilities are related to flowering phenology, at least for species that are small and have conspicuous flowers. It's maybe less the case for trees, because trees, people have the highest relative probability to observe them in winter when there is just no other vegetation to be seen, mostly. So that's one product that we have, and the other thing we focused on was on potential dominance of forest trees in this case, because we heard a bit about it, right? These models explicitly learn to discriminate observation probabilities between species, which is not possible when you do an individual model for each species at a time. And this really improves the capacity then also to look at what are the most likely species to be observed. So what we can do this at high resolution as well, given we have the 25 meters, and overall the patterns match expectations quite well. When we compared against forestry data, we were correct in about 50% of cases, so there is still room to improve. But given that this is citizen science database, I think it's a nice first start. So those were the two most important results we got from that study. And then there was some interest in, from people to really go and look at the site they are interested, what's the model output there. So we had the question, how can we make the full capacity of this deep STM available to the interested public? And well, I'm here hosted by PlantNet, so they know very well for years. Web Maps is actually a very good solution. So that's what we explored as well, trying to put this somehow online. And there are two ways of doing this, basically. One is static maps, and this we have now very nice standard solutions in web programming to load tiled maps of a background. In this case, it was just a standard map of Swiss Topo, and superimpose it with a tiled up map of anything. In this case, again, it's the most dominant forest trees. So the advantage here is such a solution, you can zoom in, zoom out very fast as a user. You get a large-scale overview, and essentially you can map any property, right? You just need a map. However, if you have a deep STM that gives you a prediction for thousands of species for each day in the season, you would have to generate tons and tons of maps in order to really capture the entire flexibility of the model. And if you want to update the model because you have better predictors, you would have to do the whole exercise again. So it's not really flexible to handle the highly diverse models or models with a diverse output. And the other option are basically dynamic solutions where you still have a web map where you can zoom, but in this case, like you choose a selection of a location, and maybe you have an input mask that gives you the option to have some other parameters defined that then allows you to get an output. And that's what we are experimenting with at the moment. So on the one hand, you can make community requests for selected points. You get the most likely species ordered by growth form. And in this case, they are also linked to the species sheets of InfoFlora. So that already existed. Here you see the observed occurrences. And so that's one solution. You can also do it with polygons. But in the end, it's mainly this ranking across all species. Another thing that you can do then, you can look at spatial patterns. So we go to another place and choose a transect along an elevation gradient in this case. But I have to say, like maybe if you look at the pros and cons here, it doesn't work if you want to do many square kilometers, because if you have high resolution data, it just takes a lot of time to compute things like this for large scales. But if you are mainly interested in small scale differences, this can be an interesting solution. So in this case, now, like I first made a request across all species, then I picked 3 specific ones, and I mapped the relative observation probability across the gradient that was selected here by the polygon, showing some differences. And the points that you can see here is basically the cell centers of the environmental grid that was used to train the model. And then the last one, it's about seasonal patterns, because that was another dimension that we can access, right? So in this case, we go to some mountainous region. Again, check what is there expected, and now I pick a few with a similar maximum probability, but different phenologies, which takes a moment. very soon. And then you can see the seasonal evolution, and you see that some of the species you might expect early in the season and others late. So the idea really would be to have such options for people who go to the field or want to find a specific species, so they have an idea where and when to go. And this is a last example where I picked now 3 locations across an elevational gradient and one species that occurs in across a broad range of elevations, to also show that, as in the map before, that we have some differences in these peaks of observation probability. So I hope I didn't take too long. So just to say this, I tried to get funding now to do this properly. I mean, I heard from Benjamin that to really make this operational, it might be quite a long way, but still, I think that's one key advantage of these big models that cover the whole flora at once and have flexible output. In such a case, you can really make this available to users, and such a dynamic solution also allows you to essentially add additional taxa or maybe different models. So it's very flexible to expand in that direction once you have defined an input mask. So in conclusion, we saw that recommender systems can be used to analyze and predict community composition from compilations of partial assemblage data, no environmental predictors involved. We have seen that deep SDMs have an advantage in predicting potential dominance and are also useful to look at seasonal differences in observation probability. And finally, deployment of these models in an interactive fashion is a very interesting way to make these outputs available to a broader user group. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Is there any question or comment?
Thank you, Philip. I like your analogy between responders and observers and movies and species, but I will see more species like observers and habitat or location like movies, because species like more or less locations or habitats. So is your framework totally symmetric, or there is a kind of asymmetric?
Actually, in the case of the Poisson factorization, it's perfectly symmetric. So in the end, it's a semantic whether we recommend species to sites or sites to species. What is important to mention here as well is it's Poisson distribution, so it's really designed for long-tailed data, which apparently is a shared commonality between movies and users and plants and sites. In many cases, or in both cases, we have few that consume many movies or are observed at many sites, very prevalent species, right? And we also have many sites with few species and few with many, as we have many movies with few watchers and few with many. So yes, it's symmetrical, and it should account for the long-tail distribution of the data.
So for you, it's more a statistical choice than something where species look at locations or vice versa? Yes. I mean, for this algorithm, it's really, it models the interaction. It doesn't model sites or species, so it's ignorant of this distinction. Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to, so with the matrix factorization, this recommender system, was it just a challenge for you to not use the environmental information? Because I guess you could include it also additional to the latent variables in the matrix factorization. So did you not use it because you had it? Did you not use it as a challenge, or?
It's a good point. Actually, in the beginning, we were quite optimistic that by combining the two, we would, create a super model that outperforms everything. But that didn't turn out to happen. I mean, you're right. You could just add, in addition to this vector of latent site-specific variables, you could add variables, and then you can do different, because like there's linear coefficients, so you would have to make some transformations. We have explored this a little bit. What we found is that typically the model sucked up the environmental variance very much and didn't really learn anything from the interactions anymore. But given that it's a linear model or relatively simple statistical model, it didn't really keep up then with a random forest, for example. So we went a different way and really tried to explore what can we learn from the feature space rather than trying to advertise a model that outperforms state of the art.
So thank you very much, Philip. I think that we can move to the next speaker if it's okay for you.
Thanks again. Thank you.